Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me. I will talk about museums this morning. And basically, I brought you 3 different projects. 2 of them don't want to be called museum anymore, and I will try to explain why that is. One is a museum Marieke van Bommel will also talk about. I'll end my lecture with that. But briefly, in advance, I would like to talk about something else. I would like to talk about the city. As you all know, cities are under permanent change. And cities are also under permanent debate. In order to, let's say, make you aware of the tension between the public debate and architecture, I would like to start with Émile Zola and Guy de Maupassant, fiercely opposing Gustave Eiffel's entry for the World Exhibition in Paris in 1888. And they claimed that the design proposed by Eiffel, eventually executed, of course, was an outrage, was raping the Parisian skyline, was violating the Parisian identity, and was, as they claimed it, one of the most tangible, preposterous proposals of modernism. Of course, as we all know, more than a century later, Gustave Eiffel's tower is considered one of the most typical Parisian artifacts as we can imagine. If we talk about Paris, we immediately think about the Eiffel Tower, the city of light, the city of love. And for us, let's say, as tourists, of course, the Eiffel Tower does embody a very Parisian feeling. It's kind of grandeur, the light, the splendor, the stacked public terraces. So, what is identity of a city? And how does a building contribute to that? And can a building contribute to that? Guy de Maupassant and Émile Zola, of course, claimed that it could not, that a building like the Eiffel Tower would be of a preposterous proposal and would never fit into the Parisian fabric. No, I'm touching the wrong. Yeah. The second person I would briefly like to talk about is this angry young man, Adolf Loos. As you all know, he wrote a pamphlet called Ornament und Verbrechen, Ornament and Crime. Basically, he claimed that in a contemporary bourgeois society, all expression of what a building contains should be mitigated, in fact, should be suppressed, since the public domain, and you should, let's say, the public domain should be of a communal expression, and he claimed that buildings should occur like the British gentleman, well-dressed, refined, neutral in its way, but they should never convey the content, since expressing the content of a building was something which should, according to Loos, be specifically addressed in the interior of the building, since your emotions, your expression, the things you would like to convey are not to be conveyed in public life. And what we might see, and what is a question I would like to address today, is whether or not this is still a valid strategy, and whether or not contemporary buildings do express, regardless whether they are ornamented or not, regardless whether they have a particular expression, whether intrinsically they always express and carry the message they contain. The last figure I would like to use in my brief introduction is Sigmund Bauman. The philosopher claimed that in particular in Western society, Northern European Western society, let's say Germany, the Netherlands, the UK for that matter, are traumatized by globalization. They are in fact under a permanent pressure and under a permanent fear. Fear for the other, fear for change, fear for diseases, fear for economical decline, fear for the Chinese. And under pressure of this globalization, we of course retreat into what we know, we retreat in what we consider our own identity, and we retreat in order what we considered the most viable way as we would have done it 30, 50, 60 years ago. Bauman claims, however, that due to this change, due to this globalization, we cannot define anymore what our identity is. Our identity is, so to speak, a liquid identity that has to be defined over and over again, that has to be redefined over and over again, and that identity also is in a way underpinned or supported by a collective experience, and that in a way to stand out and to deal with the pressure of globalization and to deal with the changes caused by globalization, we should try to establish moments of collectivity, moments where within this temporal collectivity we can redefine ourselves and we can redefine the reason why we are together. Bon, so we had Zola, we had Loos, we had Bauman, and I will try to explain how this relates to museum architecture and how this relates to public buildings in general. As said, I will show you 3 different museums, all 3 competitions we won, some 20 years ago, some recently. And what I will address in particular is the way they relate with the general audience, the way they search for a temporal collective expression, and the way they are proposing a temporal identity both to support a particular part of the city or to support the collection or to support civic society in general. The first building, which is called an institute, was a competition we won, and it was the former Audiovisual Museum of the Netherlands. The Audiovisual Museum comprised all non-fiction audiovisual heritage, that is radio, documentaries, television, whatever was produced in the Netherlands and broadcasted was collected there since the invention of the medium. And the museum consists out of 5 different entities. These different entities had to do with the fact that the museum was in fact a merger between different institutes. And I will show you briefly a few models we made 20 years ago in order to explain to the client how the building was composed. So you had, now, let's say, I won't dare to touch the pointer, but yeah. So you had an archive, you had places where the archives was restored, you had an office building, you had a museum building, and then you had a large communal middle part, which in fact established the heart of the building. So all these elements were put together into this Euclidean cube, and the Euclidean cube was sunken halfway into the ground. And the essence, of course, is the fact that all these different, let's say, elements that consist of the museum are brought together around this large open middle area. So what does this middle area do? How does it perform? Let's say, in fact, what we intended to do is to provide a large square. The square opens up 5 levels into the ground, showing this kind of majestic canyon comprising all archives and comprising all restoration area of the Institute. Above, in the air, hovers this silver-clad spaceship comprising the museum spaces, and adjacent to you in this reflective glass facade are the offices located. The main gesture, however, is in this communal area, providing a space that was not necessarily demanded for, bringing together the museum, the archive, the offices, and all other functions that in a way propel and form the essence of the public domain of the Dutch broadcasting area. As you can imagine, a neighborhood comprising Broadcasting Institute is quite a depressing neighborhood with these large studio spaces, introverted facades, everybody looking onto a screen and not looking outside. So by providing this square for the neighborhood and providing this large open middle space, all of a sudden we create an anchor for the neighborhood, but we also created an anchor for the audiovisual heritage as such. Adjacent to that, as you can imagine, an audiovisual heritage institute does not have a Mona Lisa. They don't have a Mona Lisa that you can put on the wall. In fact, all audiovisual heritage only exists when you put it into a VCR recorder or when you put it into a disc player. So we were searching for a metaphor where the notion of projection or the notion of casting light through something in order to reveal something was conveyed in the central space of the museum. So we developed, in close conjunction with an artist and the glass production industry, we developed a special kind of glass that conveyed that feeling, where by having light falling through it, let's say, and the lights and shadows shifting through the day, cause the notion or evoke the notion of a projection and display through other means. And, of course, all communal spaces are located in this space. As an opposition to Adolf Loos, you could say, we developed all kinds of interior finishings evoking the notion of radio microphones or other displays, and of course they integrated sound insulation as such, but they contributed to the notion of what the museum is all about. The main museum space, and I will not talk about it in depth, comprised a vast space composed out of pavilions, and within these pavilions all the different kind of tapes were displayed in order to understand the content of the exhibition. As said, the building, the main urban gesture of the building as a means to form this kind of temporal collective is the central square. And this central square is, in a way, also a living room for the Netherlands. All kinds of shows in order to support disasters somewhere in the world are emitted and conceived from this room. All kinds of prize and award shows are located within this space. The facade conveys a notion of audiovisual media, and we used the reference of a famous 1632 painting by Willem van Haagt. It depicts the cabinet of Dr. van der Geest, and Dr. van der Geest had all kinds of paintings in his possession. However, Willem van Haagt also added other paintings that did not exist or that did not belong to Dr. van der Geest. In a way, he imagined a world of images that could have been in this cabinet. And we use that as an analogy to develop from the source material in the Institute a glass pattern and a glass mosaic with Jaap Drupsteen that wraps around the full facade of the building, and that does evoke the notion of this contemporary avalanche of images that come to us, and at the same time this avalanche of images does also convey or does constitute a new image as such. The second building I would like to briefly talk about is, again, not a museum, but it's a natural history institute, a Naturalis biodiversity center. And again, it consists out of different elements that together form this institute. Naturalis, they are the third natural history institute in the world. So you have London, you have New York, and then Naturalis. They have 42 million natural history artifacts, and less than, I don't know, not even a promille, but less than an incredible small fraction of it is on display. However, the main focus they have is research on biodiversity and research on how the nature has been evolving the last years. So basically what we did, we refurbished an existing building, and within the existing building there were existing rooms, museum rooms, and we turned these museum rooms into storage facilities that gave a very large storage facility. There were offices around it, and a laboratory was added, and adjacent to that we added a large display or museum building. That was all combined by a large central hall. The central hall again comprised the public gesture, the gesture of what we can contribute to the world in Leiden. So you had the old building, the new laboratory building, and the new exhibition building. And also in this case, we were, in a way, searching for a proposition that conveyed natural history in different ways. It could convey natural history on a metaphorical, analogical level, as an analogy. It does convey natural history also in its art pieces. I will show you that in more detail. But it also, as on a typological level, it is conceived as a rock. So all museum rooms are within a large mountain, and you climb the mountain, and whenever you are on a landing, you enter into a large museum room. And then you climb up further, and eventually, quite similar to the Mas, you eventually overlook the city. So both in its gesture, creating this large central hall, and in the way the museum rooms are stacked, we would like to convey what natural history is all about. By doing so, we explicitly deny what Adolf Loos claimed. We explicitly open up the conversation with Loos, because we think that expressing what a building is all about is, in a way, a task that an architect should face, and a task that an architect should work with. And of course, let's say there are dinosaurs and skeletons of more than 60 million years old in the building. And there are other animals, and there's research, and the metaphorical analogy with nature occurs on different levels, in its haptic quality, in its overall flower motifs and in the way we have conceived this mountain. Together with Iris van Herpen, the famous Dutch fashion designer, we developed murals cast in concrete with a special concrete technology that evoke the permanent metamorphosis of life and that do convey almost in a 19th century manner, let's say, progress of evolution. Like you know, in the Natural History Museum in London, for instance, you have all highlights of natural history depicted in the inner facade of the building. We, of course, as children of the 21st century, we do think that evolution and a permanent metamorphosis of life is the thing we should convey and not necessarily the highlights of it. Here you do see that in more detail. So, thinking back about Adolf Loos and thinking back about Émile Zola, what we claim is that either public building should enforce the quality of public life by means of its public nature, but also by means of contributing this large central hall, in this particular case, that is always open to the public. So you can enter full ground floor of this institute without paying a ticket. You can see a large research room without paying a ticket. You can get there regardless whether you can afford being there or not. The last building I will briefly talk about, because Marieke will of course also talk about it, is the Museum aan de Stroom. Basically, as part of my argument, of course, the Museum aan de Stroom is maybe even a political statement. As you might know, when we did this competition in 2000, in 1999, 2000, so that's literally 20 years ago, this particular part of Antwerp was in a derelict state. There was prostitution, there was all kinds of illegal trade, large trucks with goods, stolen goods were standing there, and you could obtain whatever you would like to obtain in this particular part of the city. So one of the things we considered viable was first of all to create a civic gesture. And at that time, and still actually, there were only 3 towers in the inner city of Antwerp. You had, of course, the tower of the church, expressing the power of a religion. You had the tower of the police, the politietoren, expressing state power. You had a banking corporation, KBC Bank, with a tower. But there was not any place within the full Antwerp inner city where the public, the audience, the inhabitants of Antwerp could go and overlook their own city. So what we thought that was we should come to a building where the inhabitants of Antwerp could overlook their city. Hence we proposed to make a building which is a museum tower. By doing so, we were able to liberate the full site from built substance, since instead of making a horizontal pancake, we made a tower instead. And this tower was conceived in a very simple and straightforward manner by turning all museum rooms and rotating them in a 45 or in a 90-degree angle. You had a large cascading steps stepping up, and eventually in these steps, as you can see here, we integrated escalators, and these escalators culminate on a roof terrace overlooking the street. We also had the idea that the steps would coincide with a cascading idea about the city history, and eventually, if you could overlook the 21st century, you would also be confronted with 21st century artifacts. Probably Marieke will talk about that as well. So within the expression of the building, we thought that notifying the fact that you are in Antwerp was of utmost importance, but at the same time, you should enjoy the public space in the building, enjoy the public galleries overlooking the city, comprising the escalators and constituting large balconies that eventually help you to orient and to be in the building itself. I won't address the ethnographic collection of the Janssen gift to the museum. Maybe Marieke will talk about it. But again, I will stress the fact that the building consists of a public endeavor. It brings public life to this former derelict area in Antwerp, and due to that, this area of the city completely changed. Of course, there's a lot of debate about it, whether the building enforced gentrification of this particular part of the city, but as a result, former derelict warehouses were turned into housing, former abandoned sites were reused, and a kind of complete transformation of this area started.
Thanks a lot.
I'm almost finished.
Okay. Give you 2 minutes.
There were 2 things I would like to mention.
Okay.
If you are on the roof, you look back into the square. And one of the main gestures in this square is the fact that you have a large mural by Luc Tuymans, the famous Flemish painter, in fact depicting what a museum is also all about. It makes us aware of life and death, and it makes us aware also of the way life develops in a city and the way life eventually comes to an end. Thank you very much for your attention.